Welcome, Philip. Welcome to this conversation concerning refugees and Environmental Physiotherapy Association. My first question, what will be the connection between refugees and environmental physiotherapy for you?
Yeah, I think that's something to be explored. Maybe like first of all, thank you for the invite, and for this, what's the connection is really, I think it's a question that we can explore a little bit together. And maybe that's also a good lead in, and as a kind of caveat from my side, that I think that in the context or in the world of physiotherapy, the discussion around physiotherapy and refugees and refugee health is pretty new in itself. Um, Even more new maybe is how all that links up with maybe environmental issues or environmental perspectives in the broader sense of environmental physiotherapy. So a lot of, I think, what I can talk about today is not my knowledge, it's more my questions, it's some of the things that I find interesting in this kind of space. And it's very early days, so I'm still trying to make sense of all the different links and different possibilities here. And I definitely don't have any kind of, it's not I'm presenting a ready knowledge, it's more just a thinking space. Yeah.
Well, this actually, well, thank you. Well, it fits well because the part that we are talking, it's more concerning the future of physiotherapy and in which direction. So actually what you say, what we don't know is nice, but actually it's nice to explore what kind of images can we present concerning physiotherapy refugees, physiotherapy and environment refugees, climate refugees. So what's actually there in this kind of in this new world,
Yes.
or what are we going to face towards the future? But
Yeah.
you just told me that you have some actually, if we start exploring, it seems to me that you already had some questions in which directions you were thinking.
Yeah. I mean, of course, and I have questions and thoughts and ideas in different directions. So I think the basic connection to something like an environmental physiotherapy perspective on the question of physiotherapy and refugees is that something that is actually increasingly well known today is that climate migration kind of is already happening and will likely continue to happen a lot more. Now, to explain that, maybe it's basically migration that happens as a result of environmental degradation. So environments change in such ways that they're not livable habitats anymore for people. And as a result, people have to move away and seek other places to live, and so this is kind of one of the kind of first or most obvious links maybe that we can see. And then that just means at a baseline, it means that some of what we have to engage with if we're thinking about refugee health and physiotherapy is that some people that we might classify as refugees will be refugees as a result of climate change and other environmental issues. And so we will also be engaging with them and with their health. And this is one sort of very kind of direct link to begin with. Yeah.
Oh, this right. This directly interesting, because in a latest report, the GRID report, if I'm correctly, then most of the displacements of people actually happens based on disasters instead of conflict. And so disaster is the major driver for migration or displacements. And then it would be actually, if you say from it's environmental degradation in a lot of cases, so it would be quite interesting to maybe to dive a little bit deeper to what does that mean for us as a profession.
Yeah.
Because I think it's both that we're going to meet people who suffer or engaged environmental degradation, or and environmental degradation in itself as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the thing with disasters is very interesting, because what we also know today about these kind of extreme weather events, let's call them, is that a lot of like they have a much higher frequency and a much higher intensity today because of climate change and other environmental problems. So if most people are kind of displaced because of that, it's this is directly has to do with problems like climate change and other environmental issues. Where's my thinking at the moment? So I think, you know, for me, the interesting thing there is that normally, I think that physiotherapy normally thinks about itself as a kind of physical rehabilitation profession. We most comfortably engage in that kind of space. But for me, from a perspective of, okay, let's think about some of the links to, you know, to the environment in a bigger way, and about the relationship between physiotherapy and the environment in a broader way. I think what's interesting to me is like to think about, well, if we're looking at kind of rehabilitating people that are struggling as a result of these issues, why are we not looking in a kind of preventative space as well, and thinking about addressing those issues directly as well, as a means of prevention that, you know, would make some suffering and some rehabilitation unnecessary possibly. And yeah, I think there's it's a very big jump to think in that direction for physiotherapy, but I think it would theoretically be a very exciting one, and maybe even necessary one for future physiotherapy.
But this also kind of brings us from physiotherapy as a profession into curation or rehabilitation. That actually what you say, you have to see it in a broader sense. In itself, it reminds me at your one of your blog posts that you put on the environmental physiotherapy, the body of physiotherapy. What's the body? What is there actually happening? So physiotherapy is treating life in itself. But in this case, you directly go there from, as we see in the whole profession, that instead of just curing or solving the problems, we can look upon the causes of the causation of factors between it. And that's what you mean, isn't it? That we, as
yes, yes.
we have a role there as physiotherapists.
Yeah. Well, I would like to think so. I mean, this is the thing, you know, I would like to think so. I would like to see our profession develop at least a little bit in that direction, if not a lot in the future, because to me, speaking as a physiotherapist who's also worked clinically quite a few years, I know my sense of frustration, and I know that a lot of colleagues share this, a sense of frustration of having to seeing people suffer from conditions that potentially would have been preventable, and having to address health problems rather than contribute to positive health of people in a way. And to me, like also to think about the causes of, so yes, we can treat people that are that require, let's say, physical rehabilitation as a result of some kind of displacement, and this is necessary, probably always will be, you know, once those problems have developed. But as a medical professional or healthcare professional of some sort, it's not so unusual for us to think about not just the symptoms of, you know, what a problem looks like when it's developed, but also of its causes. And so if we're thinking about causes, and we know that, you know, climate change, environmental degradation are kind of causative factors of some of this migration that we're seeing today and that we'll continue to see, why not also develop some kind of stand, if not a response to those causes as well, and do something on them also.
This makes sense. So what you say, so in order not just to help people who suffer from this preventative conditions, which, if I put it in a kind of a Dutch saying, it's kind of carrying water towards the sea if we keep on doing this.
Yes, yeah.
Isn't it? So
absolutely,
it's an endless job, which
absolutely
we have to do, but at the same time, it's kind of naive not to look upon where it's coming from what other factors. So we have to start learning from it.
Correct. Absolutely. 100%. Yeah, that's exactly it. I like that. Recently, you know, of course, there's been a lot of, or there still is major fires in the United States. And I was just thinking, you know, imagine that, you know, physical therapists or physiotherapists wanted to get involved in those fires, which are also extreme weather events. But the only solution we had, or the only thing we had, was to rehabilitate people after they've suffered, you know, some kind of injury during those incidents. that I just perceive that as incredibly frustrating, because it's like I say, so we're not even looking at the fires and trying to prevent the fires or something like that, you know. Uh, to paraphrase a silly idea, you know, we're maybe at best we're just raking the leaves in the wood in the forest, but we're not doing anything about the fires. Yeah. Yeah.
No,
So yeah.
so it looks like we're constantly one step behind, and
Yeah.
because we're not looking, uh, we have to adjust a little bit our compass or our scope,
Mm-hmm.
our vision. But
Yeah.
what do you suggest for what do you envision
Mm.
as a way that we can alter our scope as physiotherapists in this sense?
You know, I'm not entirely sure, and one of my hopes, like in working in this field, is to be able to gather so many creative minds together that we can together come up with a variety of solutions to your question, maybe, you know, and to
Yeah.
how to broaden our scope. Another image that's really good and really helpful, I think, is like physiotherapy is oftentimes kind of, we behave like the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, you know, when people have fallen off already. But I would just like us, you know, there is also this image that's used, you know, that we try and move a little further upstream to what is causing people fall off the cliff. Um, so I think there is a lot of possibilities there. I like to think that there is a lot of possibilities there if we broaden our thinking, because actually the causes are also so wide and so complex. There will probably be a whole lot of different entry points. Yeah.
This kind of well, it gets me thinking actually
Mm,
in
mm,
here.
mm,
If we talk about physiotherapy, and I'm kind of look a lot of times in as a person in with a task in an environment, and as a physiotherapist, we constantly have to focus on adjusting the person or the task. So we
mm,
make a person to prepare for the tasks in a certain environment, but
mm.
actually we hardly use the environment in itself. Yeah, well, we make
Yes,
we
yeah,
flatten the
interesting.
floor with in having an air pollution environment. We can create, we also have a, which is in a longer stance,
Mm,
we can also help people to get more into the woods, for example, on a short
yeah.
circuit, or actually to be on a longer run, prevent air pollution way more using less
Mm,
cars, for example.
yeah, I mean, for example, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's the environment in itself is also something which is of influence for us as physiotherapists, not only on the short run but also on the long run.
Absolutely. And I think that this is there's an interesting analogy in, like, in terms of what you're describing here, because what I think is like what we in physiotherapy, or what physiotherapists haven't appreciated yet as a profession, is actually the true environment in which the health of our patients takes place. We haven't really appreciated it so far. We've only ever isolated our patients mainly from their, even from their living environments and work environments to large extents as well, but also from natural environments. And we treat them as if they're kind of isolated from that, and as if physiotherapy and health could be even thought of as isolated from that. But that's actually not true. So as a profession, we also have another task, which is to recognize that the environment that we operate in is actually much bigger than we thought so far. And actually, if we understand that the environment that we operate in is bigger than we thought so far, our own task as a profession becomes a bigger one as well. So this ICF kind of
Yeah, yeah.
words, they apply to our profession as well, you know, and about this recognition of what is the actual environment in which health and physiotherapy really take place, which is much bigger than the clinic room or something like this. And then what's our task in the bigger environment of physiotherapy and health? Yeah.
An interesting thought, because it brings us well in a kind of a responsibility.
Mhm.
And a lot of times in physiotherapy, we go to the details, like a lot of medical or paramedical professions. They go in depth into small detail and to make it more accountable. And actually, what you now suggest is like a person is also moving in a bit much bigger environment than just our treatment room, or which is called a kind of a laboratory, which is out there. Also, a profession has to go out of his own laboratory and has to go into the true world or the real world, and taking that responsibility, what it means.
So yeah, absolutely, I
Yeah,
agree. And maybe a good point there to start making this room even bigger now, or
yeah,
this environment even bigger now, and as we're talking, and I think we can do this a few times throughout the conversation. Maybe is that if we're starting to think about going further upstream and kind of going to the causes, well then yes, in the context of climate migration, and we can start thinking about what can we do in order to sort of improve, let's say, the environment itself, so that this becomes less of a problem. But we can go another step further upstream, to the next pool higher up, and we can think about, well, hang on, what is actually causing today's, or not just today's, but what has caused environmental degradation and climate change over the last, I don't know, century, or whichever time frame you choose, or not whichever time frame you choose, but let's say over the last, I don't know, few hundred years,
yeah.
four 500 years. And then what you find there, so what I'm saying is there is another layer of causes behind that, like the cause of climate migration, yes, sure, is environmental degradation, but the cause of environmental degradation, you have to go even further. And if you go there, some really interesting stuff starts opening up that I think, I don't want to say we've engaged with less, because actually in some spaces of physiotherapy, people have engaged with these questions. But then you start running up against issues like colonialism, agricultural kind of practices that we've developed, industrialism, racism, neoliberalism, capitalism, and such big words that have already fairly reliably been traced as the causes of our environmental problems today, and as a result also as the causes of climate migration associated physical health problems and mental health and so on. So we've made the environment a bit bigger by including the natural environment. Then kind of in terms of topic, we made it now even bigger by going to some of those kind of social, let's say, drivers of today's environmental problems.
But in a sense, well, it would be naive not to go so far, actually, to keep it,
Absolutely.
because you have to be realistic. And then
Correct.
every time you come up with you go to a new well, which is a little bit more upstream, you have to go from, okay, and what's it feeding this well? So you go in here. And at the same time, I can also imagine this kind of gets in for some of us, from, is this physiotherapy or morally, or maybe more an inconvenient truth from, oh, okay, so agriculture or industrialization, colonization, something which is occurred, and we can't say it hasn't occurred because we know, and we can't unknown anymore, so we have to now adjust it and
Mm,
accept it in a way.
mm, mm. Well, yeah, I think I really like what you said there before. I think that maybe it's an inconvenient truth, but like you said, and this is what I really liked, is that it would be naive not to acknowledge it, you know,
Yeah,
really naive, because the links are very, very clear, like between those things. So, I mean, I think it would, number one, it would be naive to it's like, I mean, I don't know. It's like, take the example of smoking and COPD that we used to have as an important link. Sure, we can say, well, smoking is not the issue of physiotherapy, it's COPD. But it's strange to turn our back on smoking. It must feel strange in our own guts to even think that it's possible to turn our backs onto, like, even the next layer of causes only. So I think it's, number one, we have to, I think many physiotherapists sometimes don't know these links, so first of all we have to state them. But once we know them, you can't really unknow it, and then it poses big questions.
yeah, this is good, because to go to the small example, what you have to go back to the big one.
Yeah.
As you said, the same is with COPD and smoking. It's the same with physical form and movement. We know that physical activity is important, and at the same time, we try to invent gyms and treadmills, which we should have started asking, why do we need a treadmill when we have a forest or a way out? So there's something weird in it, but it's only by um, expressing the absurd we can come to the next stage, because then we acknowledge the naivety that we think, okay, now we have to go there. If I go back to the higher well, what you just did, more upstream, as you say, we know that colonialism, industrialization, agriculturism, actually those are things that we've done, we've been part of it, and it's not so much that we can undo them because we know them, but actually I would say that they created also a kind of thinking in our way of behaving and looking upon the world. And is that what you mean also? If we understand what does it mean, we can also understand what does it mean in our thinking, and in as such in our ways of thinking and doing and acting.
Yeah. So I think like one thing that's important to say, that if we're talking, for example, about colonialism, to say that it has happened is not entirely accurate, because it's something that is happening still, just like we know very much, if you're not closing yourself off in a little room, be it a treatment room or a personal room, and closing yourself off the world, you also know that racism is a very active thing in the world still today. It's not a thing of the past or historical in any way. It's as historical as it is present. These things continue to take place, and I think they also, I'm going to say that they also take place in our profession in some way, and that our profession, maybe through lack of reflection, sometimes also supports them and or perpetuates them. And so these are not historical problems. They're very current. They're very present issues, and we need to learn how they take place still today and where, both inside our profession as well as outside, in order to be able to address them. And absolutely, I agree with what you just said, that I mean, maybe with racism it's even more clear, but as an example, but racism is not just something that sort of happens outside our bodies, right? It's something that happens in our minds, and it's something that happens like in something like collective minds, like societies. So it's and colonialism in the same way has already been described, that it's that thought and ideas can also be colonialized. For example, like we can force our ideas of, I don't know, physiotherapy upon others, so and that maybe includes environmental physiotherapy.
But now it starts to make sense. So actually, if we imagine futures in this sense, so it's actually quite important to go into the depth. So it's also going into the rabbit holes that were there, because actually, as you said, colonialism, something we preferable don't want to look upon it. We prefer probably as a profession not to look upon discrimination, racism, because we do the best thing. It sometimes takes courage actually as a profession to look upon oneself, to see what's the colonial thoughts in it, or what are the less open-minded thoughts.
I think there's something important in what you just said there, and that's that I think a lot of what we're talking about right now, what it implies for our profession is that when we engage with a new field, for example, like the field of refugee health, we need to understand that it's, number one, it's a new field for us. And that if we come into a new field, there's probably a lot of learning that we have to do before we can necessarily take action. Like, I think we have a tendency as physiotherapy to take action very quickly, and for like good intentions and good motivations. We want to help, and of course we don't want to see people suffer, but we also have to recognize that I think sometimes rushing in is maybe not so good, because you don't understand, like you don't appreciate necessarily the complexities of the field always. And this is, I think, what we're doing maybe in our conversation right now, at least, is we're opening up a little bit more of that complexity of the field, the bigger kind of stuff the other stuff that's related and that's easily overlooked, and where we will probably have to spend a bit of time learning and thinking first, And you mentioned rabbit holes, and to me that's the other area of where we might need to have a look.
Yeah.
I can explain that more, but
yeah. Well, to go first, because I really like to go into the rabbit holes, because I really agree with you concerning a new field, because this is a new field, like environmental physiotherapy is also refugee health for us. It's a new field, which we might even say this is a kind of a migration process. We migrate as a physiotherapy profession. You migrate to new, uncharted or undiscovered territories for ourselves. So
or maybe not to, but through.
Through, yeah, because we don't, and we through an area we don't know, so we have to start learning, and we have to go. We encounter things that we haven't thought of before, for the good and for the bad, for everything. That makes also that maybe for us this area we can say is also a little bit of alienated area. With something.
Absolutely. And I think, I agree. It's really, really so new. And I think, when what I'm saying is we're not migrating to, is like, if we say migrating to, then it sounds maybe like we know where we're going, or it's clear where we're going, but we don't know where we're going yet, and we can't. We have to, like, maybe not even migrate, but meander through, go here and there and so forth, to maybe find like where to go, in the end, or where to set up shop or camp or whatever. And so I think that's really like the point that's interesting there, is that some of those words, like when we learn about a new field, we have to learn about its words as well, right? Like, what do they mean and so on. So it's really interesting. For example, even if we go back to this notion of climate migration, if we look at the definitions of refugees and migrants, refugees are understood to be those that, or kind of are defined, I believe, as those that have to flee, flee from something, and it's involuntary. Whereas with migrants, it's a little bit like, the definition is usually more voluntary or kind of, not so forced. And it's strange because when it comes to climate migration, we haven't really, for example, appreciated yet the fact that maybe they're not climate migrants. Nobody wants to move because their environment is not habitable to them anymore, but it's something else. So we need to look also at those little words of, what's a refugee, what's a migrant, and we have to learn those things first, and not just assume that, oh yeah, well, this is what this is and this is what this is, and so we know what to do. Like, the learning about a new area involves going into a lot of really kind of careful detail, or going into detail with care as well.
And at the same time also to acknowledge that we don't know, that maybe different people understand different things with the same words. And we constantly have to be charitable, that if we don't understand, don't expect people to understand, don't expect for yourself that we understand. So there might be a different meaning or wording in it. And
and so exactly. And so this is for me where again, now we can start opening that rabbit hole, or we can start diving into the rabbit hole if we want to, because if we start looking at those words, I think oftentimes it's very necessary to, like, really open our horizons and go broader, to pull information from all sorts of different places. Because, like in philosophy, we understand, for example, that words really matter. They mean one thing, like you said, one thing to one person, another thing to another, and so forth. And sometimes words express, what we think about something, or how we think about it, and so on. So to me, because I'm exploring also in this area, one of the sort of parallel discourses that is really important to me, that really, or not important, is really interesting to me, it fascinates me a lot in this regard, is that there is a parallel discourse happening in this kind of climate migration space, I would say, that has not to do with humans, but with other species than humans, animals, plants, and so on. So first of all, maybe in that regard, it's really important to understand that because of all the environmental problems of today, climate change and so on, it's not just humans that are migrating, but animals and plant species as well. So the climate migration is not exclusively human phenomenon. It's much bigger than that. And what's interesting there in this kind of discourse maybe is that there are some terms used there that, like, they're really fascinating to me. So in this, for example, there's a lot of talk in those kind of areas around so-called invasive and alien species, or pests or something like this. And it's very interesting, because I think some of those terms that we use when we speak of, other than human species, they really reflect how sort of, in some ways, how negatively we think of these kinds of movements around the world, and how unwelcome we consider them. And I think that's very true, sort of kind of a quite a astute reflection of sometimes also a lot of the negative thinking that's involved around refugees, migration, or involuntary migration, like climate migration and so on. And I think it's really helpful that when we're looking into those terms and really diving into the depth of all that we look so broad as well, that we look into these other discourses to recognize some of the patterns of human thinking when it comes to migration on this planet that we live on.
It's really interesting. So actually what you say, when we look upon different items, so migration of animals, plants, different species, rock movements, for example, in the geological age, it's mostly from a human-centric, of an anthrocentric point of view.
Yeah.
And that makes migration a lot of time mostly negative. So we have an invasive species that we have some, for example, in the Netherlands, we have some bullfrogs coming from the United States, and it's a kind of a disaster. And so we constantly predict and pronounce it in this way. That also means that our unconscious, if we can talk about unconscious way of thinking, also goes in a certain direction because we put value to something.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's also what you mean.
Absolutely.
What I get from you, if we dive into this kind of rabbit holes, we get a little bit more understanding about the value system we put upon things from different languages.
Yeah.
Which,
absolutely.
Yeah, which for a big part, please.
Yeah. No, I think that's wonderful. Like the way you just reflected that, I think is exactly right. I think, we recognize, for me, it's like my words are like, we recognize our own thought patterns. And like you say, like the value we put on things. The interesting thing is also, like, if you look into those terms, invasive and alien species, for example, which are oftentimes talked about in the context of biodiversity loss. It's one of the major environmental problems that we're having. And so the interesting thing is that we use these terms, invasive and alien species, even though, and this is the paradox, the definition of invasive and alien species is that they are species that have been introduced to other areas of the world by humans, either voluntarily or on purpose, or involuntarily. So they're not invasive, they've been like taken somewhere else. And in that way, they're also not alien, because they're definitely not to the people that brought them, so to speak. And then if you look at that, even so this is a paradox, and I think there is a parallel here, a strong parallel to what is happening in terms of refugees worldwide and climate migration, because it goes back to what we talked about before. If we trace back to the causes, what we find there is specific human causes, and oftentimes they will have to do again with the same culprits that we talked about before, which is colonialism, industrialism, globalization. The migration around the world that's happened, that's a little bit sort of different. And this is so even in that kind of like other than human species context, the same patterns are still there, like even causative, the same patterns, we come to the same problems again.
It's interesting. At the same time, what I just pick out from you is that although alienation of alien species and invasive species are not a problematic, it actually comes from the human hand. But invasion sounds like then we get to a kind of wording which is more militaristic, because we constantly change sometimes to we have to fight, we have to beat, we have to defend, offend. Those are kind of language structures. We come from a kind of a battlefield, a battleground. So, and we turn it into a battleground instead of a place of companion or collaboration.
Yeah.
This is kind of a
absolutely. And I think it's very reflective of I think, unfortunately, very reflective of many ways that, human migration, immigration, you know, being a refugee and so forth is also thought of. And it's very important to recognize how deep these patterns run in human thinking, and that we extend them just to all sorts of things,
Yeah,
humans, non-human, other than humans, animals, plants, this and that. And it's really like they're ingrained patterns. And so, in some ways, yeah, we talked about, what is causative. It's like colonialism, racism, and so forth. And what is causative also is like some of the thinking patterns that have been around for a long time and that have been quite dominant for a long time also.
yeah, and especially if we don't challenge them,
Yeah,
because this is
yeah,
also a kind of
yeah,
about keep to challenge them. It's not so about
yeah.
it's maybe not so much about change. It is not only change them. We have to, because to change them into something new can be
Mm,
creating the same kind of
mm,
problem. You
mm.
constantly have to
Yes,
keep on
yeah,
challenging them.
yeah,
Them.
yeah.
But if I now take this, if we just take a little bit a brief look upon our discussion so far,
Hmm.
then we would say if we go from in the exploration of refugees and environment from what's
Hmm.
there, the more we go upstream, the more we come up with new areas that we don't know. So we migrate ourselves, we go through different environments, so we meander through it, and we get more and more awareness of things that influence our way of thinking and
Mm,
makes us more critical. And at the same time, if we get in there, we can't keep pretending that we don't know. We know, so
mm.
we have to take a stand. We have to take responsibility. Although at the same time, if you don't take responsibility, you also take responsibility of not taking responsibility. It's not like
Yes,
either or. The
yeah,
moment you know,
yeah,
you can't not unknown these kind of
exactly.
things.
Yeah, yeah.
And if I go back, because that's the thing that I got from you from the beginning, it's also more that you, um, from your perspective, you would say from as physiotherapists, we can't just be the fire department. We can't just wait and somebody fell off the cliff. Uh, if we know all the long way back, we have to get there.
Mm,
So, and we have to take action. Maybe from a professional stand,
mm,
from micro level, but
mm,
maybe to meso level or macro level, or from
mm,
a political sense.
mm.
There are different fields or plateaus where we can work upon.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so, if we stay with this kind of, I'm going to call, with this multi-species migration theme for another
Yeah,
moment, just to respond to that, is
yeah,
that, and just to reiterate maybe some of what I've said before, the reason why I think it's interesting to engage with the kind of multi-species discourse when we're talking about physiotherapy for refugees or in refugee health is that, number one, I think that if we're going to work in refugee health, human refugee health, we need to learn about the field, and we need to identify what is our possible unique contribution to this field. Because if physiotherapists don't have a unique contribution to refugee health, there is no need for us. Okay,
okay.
it's maybe a very strong stance, but I think
Yeah.
if we don't have anything specific to contribute that somebody else is not already doing, why do it? So that's number one. Number two is that so in order to identify this unique contribution, we need to learn about the field, and we need to learn about it in breadth and in depth as well. And so what we suggested now in our conversation is we could even go to like parallel discourses that have not to do with humans but with related fields in order to learn more breadth and more depth, right? And so what I think is an interesting twist when you get to that point is that um, if we identify our unique contribution to refugee health, maybe this could inform in turn what we can do. So what we can do in order to contribute to this other field that's not just human refugee health. So if we know that biodiversity loss is a problem, and this is it's kind of it's the space where alien and invasive species are produced, maybe identifying our unique contribution, by learning about all of those fields, will even give us the opportunity to identify a unique contribution that we can make in order to help address biodiversity loss.
Oh, yeah.
So it can go like even that way, because this goes back to a question that you asked before, well, what can we do to change the
Yeah.
environment? Well, I'm not sure yet, but I can I can imagine that this could be a pathway to identify something that we can do.
Yeah, and at the same time, by creation, by having different fields and subjects, so you have to learn from the different field subjects.
Mhm.
You get a kind emerge new ways of thinking.
Yeah.
It actually reminds me something about a very known refugee from the 1900s, Einstein, who was a refugee. The moment he started writing, he wrote about an extremely huge amount of different topics, which he combined constantly, because every topic helped him to get a thinking right in different topics, because it constantly get new ideas and creates creativity.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah. Yeah. You better do. Yeah, that's really good. But now we get, actually, you have a very nice question, and the statement was almost lost in here. Is for physiotherapy, what can physiotherapists do in refugee health? And actually, we have to look upon our possible unique contribution. Of course, everybody has a contribution as human being, and maybe as a health professional. But in order to make physiotherapy, you have to look upon the unique possible contribution, because maybe there's something what we can do and have to do in order to help as a physiotherapist, which we maybe not be doing. And if we do that one in physiotherapy, it might be do something in different areas as well, like biodiversity, different ways of migration patterns, adjusting. And it's actually also something about the bigger environment.
Yeah.
But this also makes it quite difficult, because also what you said in this one, if we don't have a unique contribution, you can also have maybe a decontribution. It's which means sometimes you have to be aware also, because I just take it what you said before. We have to understand that we're learning.
Yeah.
So by experimenting, that's good, but at the same time also look upon the risk in not being a decontributor to something. So
yeah. I think, just to give a little qualifier to this comment about the unique contribution.
Yeah.
It might be that it's not necessary to identify that, but that it's just necessary to understand what needs doing and what kind of efforts we need to help and to support.
Yeah.
And what kind of efforts we need to join. So certainly one unique contribution is also that, just to join existing efforts as the unique kind of individuals that we are and the unique profession that we are. But I like to think that, yes, there would also be some kind of unique contribution that we can or that we maybe should look for, and I'd like to think that there is one. I can't really, definitely tell you at this point. If I had to make a guess, I would imagine that it's something. It's got to do, maybe one aspect of it will be that it will have something to do with movement. And generally, I think as physiotherapists, we have this idea that we want to support movement, right? Or support mobility and all those things. And so maybe part of that unique contribution is precisely, to understand that the problem that we're dealing with in refugee health is a mobility problem, partially at least, and that it's our task to facilitate mobility or something like that. And then if we're looking into the future, for me personally, maybe, yes, it's facilitating mobility of humans, it's facilitating mobility of not just humans, and of course, actually, we have some colleagues that already, they work, for example, in animal physiotherapy, and they support, movement of individual animals. But in a bigger picture of what's happening today in terms of climate migration, maybe we need to support movement on much bigger scales for humans and animals and plants and mountains, like you mentioned before, and water and, all sorts of things. And maybe that's kind of part of where the unique contribution of physiotherapy in the future could be, because you mentioned also we're kind of touching on future physiotherapy. Maybe.
Yeah. Oh, I love your way of thinking, and at the same time, looking upon movement and mobility, which we take now maybe as physiotherapy as a basic part or the major part of our profession, some possibility. But at the same time, if you take it from a larger environmental perspective, from a bigger space, not only within the laboratory of the treatment room, but in a bigger, then it would be hard not to support mobility.
Yeah, I agree. Yes,
and it will be
exactly.
hard from a conscious level not to support migration as a continuous moving factor.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting because, yeah. So I just noticed, by the way, before that I mentioned the movement of water and so forth, but your background, of course, also highlights the movement of light, right? And but no, the thing is that there is one other element. I was just looking at that a little bit earlier today. That, for example, climate migration and the migration that refugees do, the movements that refugees do, is in some ways, in let's say in quite xenophobic kind of discourses and contexts, these somehow there is a value attached, like you mentioned before, to these movements, and there is some kind of almost negative value attached to these movements. But on the other hand, colonial migration, which is movement to, from, let's say, from Europe to other places in the past, maybe even now, is not valued so negatively. Tourism is a kind of migration, and it's not valued so negatively. And so there is a question not just about facilitating mobility, but also understanding what kind of mobility maybe is to be facilitated and what isn't, and reflecting on even on mobility itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not,
and being careful about that, and not just sort of making a blanket statement. Physiotherapy, we are about facilitating mobility, and so therefore, like you said before, this army speak. Therefore, we want to support the movement of an army to, I don't know, a different place. Yeah.
No, it's more like having a positive critical stance on movement in all its factors. But actually, it's also about, it's not just doing, it's also thinking, because that's what you said in the beginning. As physiotherapy, sometimes we have the idea of acting, which is nice, but acting without reflection, it might not always become to the thing that was intended there, which is constantly, it's in process.
I think, you're exactly right. I think that's very true, and I think, in our conversation today, I don't want to claim that any of what we said here is like a final word on anything. Not at all. Like, really, again, just to repeat that from the beginning, all we did, and I think we're not able to do more, is just to briefly touch on a few points that I think need a lot more thinking and a lot more consideration and research and so on, such that we can one day make a not just unique contribution, but valuable contribution also. I mean, this is just, what we did today. Maybe at best we can describe it just like, two friendly minds going here and going there and so forth, to explore a little bit, but it's maybe a start that, can point into new directions.
Then I would say thank you so much, Philip, for taking me with you on this explorative journey, and going in here together to wander off in different direction and see what might be there. And this definitely is just the beginning. And also for us, our conversation will continue. And I hope everybody who listens to it also continues in the conversation and add new aspects and directions, because the meandering is just starting. And it's not about ending, it's about beginning and movement.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Always a pleasure.